que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario, todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario.
Hi, my name is Jorge Astilumendi, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Thanks for joining and welcome to Hurricane Readiness, Building Climate Resilience in the Caribbean event. The science is clear. We are in a trajectory bound to reach a 1.5 degree warmer world by 2040. The cost of inaction increases every day that we fail to take bold measures to address both the causes, but most importantly, for the Caribbean nations, the dangerous and increasingly ever-present consequences of climate change, from sea level rise, ocean acidification and overheating with impacts on fisheries and critical biodiversity, economy and health creep in heat waves, to unseasonably flash floods. At the Resilience Center, we've recognized this urgent need and have advanced our work to scale community-led initiatives that protect lives and livelihoods from extreme heat while driving systemic transformations to safeguard communities, cities, and economies from future climate change. As we enter this year's high-risk hurricane season, we need to have solutions-oriented discussions like this one that considers expanding ways to make people safer and stronger by reducing the physical and financial risk of climate-related threats through interventions focused on public health, biodiversity protection, food security, and risk and financial products and approaches, including insurance and debt relief innovations, all of them pointing us toward a more resilient world. We need to have the courage to take on bold action now. No time to waste. I'm happy to leave you now with this excellent panel to focus on solutions and real action in the Caribbean. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jorge, for your opening remarks, all the way from the Philippines. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian R. Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council, which houses our Caribbean initiative. As Jorge rightly said, we need to have the courage to take bold actions to address the climate crisis in the Caribbean. Bold actions are exactly what our center works toward through our Caribbean initiative. Through our regular consultations with our in-region fellows and partners, we're consistently reminded of the devastating toll climate change is having on Caribbean countries. This is why earlier this year, we partnered with the U.S. Department of State to host the PAC 2030 Road to Implementation Summit in the Dominican Republic. The summit, which took place on the sidelines of the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas ministerial meetings, featured more than 120 participants and facilitated public and private sector discussions around how to build climate resilience and facilitate energy transition in the Caribbean. On Monday, we are releasing the official readout of the summit. The readout highlights 5 recommendations to implementing PAC 2030, some of which streamlining technical assistance to regional institutions and ensuring that climate resilience is a key feature of next year's Summit of the Americas. We're following that summit with today's discussion as a call to action to the global community to provide the needed financial and technical support to Caribbean countries and other small island and low-lying developing states. To kickstart this conversation, I'm delighted that we are joined by the Barbados Minister of Home Affairs, Information and Public Affairs, the Honorable Wilfred Abrahams. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Minister Abrahams started his career. Minister, thank you so much. He started his career as an attorney, where he served as the president of the Barbadian Bar Association. He also sat on the Board of Trustees of the Caribbean Court of Justice Trust Fund, and previously served as Barbados' Minister of Energy and Water Resources. Minister, you are a leader within your government and the wider region on building climate resilience, and I'm really delighted that you've taken the time to join us today. After the minister speaks, we'll turn it over directly to Associate Director and Fellow for the Caribbean Initiative, Wazim Molla, who will moderate an expert conversation that will give a preview of what to expect for this year's hurricane season and the broader importance of building climate resilience in the Caribbean. So again, Minister, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you for your keynote remarks.
Thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to just jump right in with my time limit of 10 minutes. I'm going to speak very quickly to try to get as much information in before I hit the end. So 2024 is very concerning for us. We forecast up to 17 to 25 named storms, up to 13 hurricanes, and a probability of 7 to 9 major hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin this year reinforces the need for readiness of our national and regional emergency management mechanisms. Right now, we're experiencing almost a record May going into June. And when you're getting those sort of temperatures in May, then we expect a pretty rough hurricane season. So past experiences with climate-induced hazard events have taught us of the need to be in a state of constant readiness to tackle this impact of these hazards to our society. Achieving a climate-resilient Caribbean is a continuous task, which requires our constant, consistent, and strategic treatment of the issue if we are to successfully deal with the climate crisis. It is critical that proactive and decisive actions are taken to address diverse stakeholder needs and improve system readiness. Our systems must be agile, adaptable, and scalable to deal with the complexity of the hazard events which affect us. The integration of a comprehensive hazard management strategy and framework into the national policy space encourages and gives guidance to the multi-stakeholder engagement when dealing with and managing all hazards, including those associated with climate. For instance, Barbados has developed what are referred to as our comprehensive disaster management policy and the multi-hazard early warning systems policy, which both provide an enabling environment to support the implementation of the National Disaster Risk Management Agenda. Our various plans and programs and standard operating procedures are informed by and flow from these policies. Government must continue to provide an enabling platform for the management of hazards, which includes the annual hurricane preparedness and readiness efforts that we are obliged to undertake annually. So I actually left one of those meetings and came to join this panel. So supporting businesses and people in their adaptation must be a critical and fundamental focus of any government. The presence of emergency management policy and legislation, various platforms for multi-stakeholder coordination, for example, or Emergency Management Advisory Council and its standing committees, a national emergency management system which contemplates planning and solution-oriented inclusive dialogue on emergency management issues remains a necessary requirement for a successful and sustainable system. Our governance arrangements must include both the public as well as the private sector. I think quite often countries focus on what is under the direct control of the government, but it has to be more than that. We can't do it alone. We must ask ourselves the critical question: how can we increase private sector participation in the implementation of climate resilient programming? In building a climate resilient Caribbean, one must understand and appreciate that climate threats and potential impacts. We must understand them. Improved climate services will certainly contribute to the application of the data for decision-making by sectors and the public, resulting in reduced business interruptions. The development and enhancement of data management systems which collect, analyze, manage, and support the visualization of the data for decision-making, both in an active crisis management event or to improve developmental planning and public investment is necessary. The science facilitates evidence-based decision-making. For instance, in recent times, there's been a consistent effort by the government through the Barbados Material, which supports the development of forecasts. Additionally, are you hearing me clearly? It's telling me my connection is unstable.
Yes, we hear
Hello?
you. Yes, it went in and out, but we hear you.
Okay. Additionally, there's been a concerted effort made to process and repackage the data and information for various stakeholders. So Met Services puts out a lot of information for us, but we don't deliver the information in one format across the board. You deliver the information for fishermen targeted at fishermen, for farmers targeted at farmers, for tourism and healthcare sector stakeholders, we deliver it purpose-built for them. So this move to impact-based forecasting focuses on what the weather can do, how it affects various members of the public and businesses, among others. So even down to our alerts, we will give the alerts with sufficient information for those who require them to make decisions in a timely manner. So sea swells, raising sea swells, or things that are of impact to marine persons, so fishermen or whatnot, those will come before alerts that concern land-based people, because the marine persons may need to come back into safe harbor. So that's just an example. So developing and implementing risk awareness campaigns that sensitize persons to hazards such as the hydromet hazards and their impacts. On an annual basis from May to November, the government-led public awareness campaigns promoting hurricane awareness and readiness is rolled out in Barbados, utilizing all media platforms and a diverse talent pool and targets at-risk populations. There are other campaigns during the year that also cover other hazards and risks that may affect the population. So risk advocacy and raising awareness is an essential modality to engender hurricane readiness and resilience building, because an informed population will make more appropriate choices. So we've expanded past the traditional means of getting information out. We've expanded past the national television station. We've expanded past the government information systems. So when we're trying to get emergency broadcasts out, then we also employ social media influencers. So persons who have large followings in Barbados, we will actually use them as a way to broadcast the information as well. We did a pause after an event, and we tested our early warning system, and we found out that when we pushed the warnings out, the information out, it got to half of Barbados, or less than half of Barbados, within 2 hours. So that was unacceptable. We found that when we did the broadcasts and we interrupted radio stations and we did the public service broadcasts, then what happened is they went straight back to playing their music. So they would have broadcast for the purpose of the broadcast, but there was no follow-up. So we need to put policies in place to deal with that. So developing and implementing risk awareness campaigns. So partnership and collaboration for climate resilience to assist in augmenting gaps in our systems. The system of disaster management is built on partnership and collaboration. So entering into agreements and memorandums of understanding are an innovative way to channel much needed resources to support readiness. So regardless of the phase, whether the preparation phase, response or recovery phases, etc. To offer an example, the Barbados Department of Emergency Management has a long outstanding arrangement with the roving response team to support national emergency responses when dealing with the effects of climate-related disasters. The Ministry of Home Affairs, Department of Emergency Management, and the radio broadcasters in Barbados have established agreements to support the National Multi-Hazard Early Warning System, which warns the population on impending danger.
So I think that the minister.
Suppliers.
Please go on, Minister.
Sorry, what is the last thing you heard?
Sorry, Minister, are you there?
Okay, I'll continue. Yes, I am here.
Please continue. You only jumped off
Okay.
for a couple of seconds.
Okay. Within a regional context, we can reflect on the Caribbean's regional response mechanism, which supports regional readiness efforts when dealing with various disasters and emergency events. So our regional response mechanism is an operational mechanism with architecture for supporting coordination support to impacted states. Question is, how can we scale up this proven operational model that has served the Caribbean government so well? With respect to social protection systems, ensuring that social protection systems are available and catered to the most vulnerable and at risk in our communities. These social protection programs should be designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability, diminish exposure to risk, and enhance the beneficiaries' capacity to manage economic, social, and environmental risks. Barbados has had a history of offering housing assistance to qualifying persons who've been victims of disasters. With the last Hurricane Elsa that hit Barbados, a lot of the persons, it was the most vulnerable who were affected. So they're the persons who are in the worst of the housing stock. They're the ones who don't have insurance. And the government committed to rebuilding all of the houses, repairing and rebuilding all of the affected houses from Hurricane Elsa. That is still in progress. It's almost crippled the coffers of the government, but it's something that we needed to do to ensure that Barbadians could get back on their feet. This leads us to the next thing, safeguarding infrastructure. So the implementation of which seek to provide the Caribbean region. Strengthening the infrastructure, particularly at the sectoral level, is a key component to building the region's resilience. Standards assist in reducing infrastructural vulnerability to hazards. Standards and techniques as it relates to safer building and retrofitting must be a feature of any hurricane preparedness. After Hurricane Elsa, when we lost so many roofs, the government implemented a hurricane strap program. We call it Strap It, which sought to make straps available to householders in order to reinforce their roofs. And the Roof to Reef program is also another initiative that seeks to enhance infrastructural integrity of houses. So basically what it is the danger is not necessarily losing the roof covering, so the galvanizer or whatnot, because once the structure of the roof remains, you can put a tarp over it and secure it for a little bit, or you can actually reinstall the roof. The problem is when the whole roof structure goes. So programs such as giving hurricane straps to those who can't afford them, or even installing them for persons, goes towards our safeguarding infrastructure. A key aspect to building climate resilience in the Caribbean from a risk financing perspective speaks to enhancing the disaster recovery mechanism as it relates to a country's disaster risk financing portfolio. Many countries in the Caribbean are signatory to the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which offers a level of security and emergency funding for immediate response and recovery activities. Many countries have benefited through payouts from this parametric insurance facility. Similarly, several countries have sought to expand their financial risk management portfolio for disaster risk by including contingent credit facilities in the case of Bahamas and Barbados, and catastrophe bonds in the case of Jamaica. What I will say here as I come to the end is I think one weakness in our system is that we keep concentrating on the rebuilding afterwards. We keep concentrating on how quickly we can get facilities and realize financial assistance to repair. This is a case where, quite frankly, you need to pay it forward, because the more resilient we make our structures in our country is the less we have to try to rebuild after. So I think we need to shift our focus slightly, and our financing partners need to help us to shift our focus slightly from repairing after a disaster to trying to reinforce, rebuild, make more resilient before a disaster. So what are the takeaway questions? What other options are present that supports climate resilience? Is there room for public-private sector financing arrangements? Is there a space for multi-donor trust funds? How do we attract predictable and sustainable financing for climate resilience? Our efforts should be programmatic and demand-driven as opposed to being ad hoc and project-driven.
Thank you, Minister. So I think while Minister Abrams, his Wi-Fi connectivity hasn't been too great towards the end.
I believe that I've given you must be inclusive, innovative. They must cater to the diversity of the stakeholders and their needs, to stakeholders and their needs. And most importantly, our efforts must be sustainable. They must be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much for those remarks, and for leaving a meeting to join us here today for this event. I think when we discussed this event at the outset, it being really a call to action to the global community, what better call to action than you taking time out of your busy schedule to ensure that you're raising awareness of the specific challenges facing not just Barbados, but the wider Caribbean with regard to climate change and hurricanes. And one big takeaway from your remarks, the more resilient the Caribbean is, the less need there is for rebuilding. And I think that dovetails very well into our conversation today and the wider necessity for having this conversation. So we once again very much thank you, and we very much look forward to working with you and your government, not just today, but in the future as well. So now that Mr. Abrams has concluded his remarks, I would like to first thank Jason Marzak for some of his comments, and for Jorge Casumendi at the opening for really talking about this being really a call to action for hurricane season. And for our towards the end of this conversation, this panel discussion that we will now have, we're really going to touch on building climate resilience in the Caribbean. A lot based on some of the minister's comments, the role of the international community, and then also, which was a key component of the minister's comments, how to encourage the private sector to be part of climate adaptation and climate solutions. Also, we'll touch on, since this year, the Atlantic Council, despite also being a global organization, will be on the sidelines of the G20 finance ministers meetings in Brazil. We'll also look at, and also at COP29 later this year, we'll also hear from some of our distinguished speakers on what are some of the commitments we want to see out of these global forums with regard to climate adaptation, resilience, and finance. So for this conversation, to discuss this and more, we have a great lineup. I'm very proud of the lineup of speakers that we have with us today. First, we're joined by St. Kitts and Nevis Ambassador to the United States and Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States, Ambassador Jason Henry Martin. Ambassador Henry Martin is here. It's her second stint as ambassador to the United States, is a former Minister of Information, Culture, Youth, and Sports, and has been a leader here in Washington among the different CARICOM caucus of ambassadors, and very happy to have you with us. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. We're also joined by Therese Turner-Jones, who's the Acting Vice President of Operations at the Caribbean Development Bank. Therese previously served as a General Manager of Caribbean Countries Group at the Inter-American Development Bank, has been a huge leader for women in the Caribbean as well, and is widely known as an international expert on all development priorities within the region and other small island states. We're also joined by Stacey Swan, who is a founder of Resilient Earth Capital and former CEO of Climate Finance Advisors. Stacey has worked across the World Bank and the IFC, and from 2021 to 2024, even sat on the Climate Council of Exim Bank. We were talking before we had this event. She also joined us in the Bahamas last year for the PAC 2030 Climate Resilient Clean Energy Summit, and also is a member of our PAC 2030 working group. Also, another member of our PAC 2030 working group, last but not least, is Roger Powater. He was a senior scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Roger has worked in tandem with many Caribbean governments and multilateral agencies, is the U.S. co-chair for the UN Sustainable Development Goal for Water, and was recognized with the Presidential Rank Award in 2022 for his achievements in research and education in a lot of these areas. So thank you all for joining us. We're very, very excited for this conversation, especially as tomorrow kicks off hurricane season in the Caribbean, which will run towards the end of November, and there's definitely a lot that needs to be done, not just today but in the future as well. So to kickstart the conversation, really want to get a baseline from all of our speakers. Really, tomorrow is the beginning of hurricane season, right? There's lots been in the news about it, but we really love, Roger, maybe to start with you, what can we expect from this year's Atlantic hurricane season? And I think we all look out for that press release from NOAA, right, on what the hurricane season will look like. And Minister Abrams has shared a little bit of some of the statistics there, but I'd love to get your perspective on what we can expect, and then we'll go to some of the other speakers as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Wazim, and thanks for having me. And thinking about what we're going to see, and as many people on the call know, NOAA has a strong relationship in the Caribbean. I'm a Trini, as you could tell from my accent. But the idea, however, is that the network with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the National Met and Hydro Services, including with Barbados and elsewhere, is extremely close because of the links between the Caribbean basin, the US and elsewhere. As we think through what's coming up, and these are all, when you see the forecast, these are all well coordinated across the scientific agencies. We are anticipating a hurricane season of about 85% of being above average. And as the minister said, about 17 to 25 total named storms. That's more than 39 miles an hour, 8 to 13, probably 11 that are 75 miles an hour or higher, and about 4 to 7, 3 to 5 category hurricanes stronger than 110 miles an hour. That becomes really critical simply because the reason we can say that is because we know that the background ocean heat content in the Atlantic is much warmer than normal. We're about to see some more active West African monsoon that helps launch easterly waves that actually structure some of the strongest storms. The trades are lighter. In other words, the storms get a chance to form. And of course, critically, as everyone knows, we have the movement from an El Nino event to a La Nina event. And what that means is that all of those conditions are favored for this higher number of tropical storms. So the Pacific Ocean, of course, impacts the Caribbean. And years ago, we did a whole set of studies to show that the Caribbean is one of the few places in the world that has two impacts from any La Nina or El Nino event. In other words, one year you might see the reduction in hurricanes, but then the oceans start heating up and you see rainfall at the wrong time. So we're basically seeing this chance, the strong likelihood, actually a 70% chance of having more than 85% being above average this coming season. But I wanted to put that in the context of something else. We are in the midst in the region of one of the most severe droughts on record as well. And the other analogous year to this was 2010. In which the region had one of its most severe droughts, then had 3 years of extremely active storms from basically the hurricane season of 10, 11, and 12 turned out to be 3 of the most active years on record, 19 storms each. And when we think through this, how we manage going from dry to very wet, then to dry, becomes the essence of the cases that we're going to hear about and what we're thinking, which is creating an integrated view of climate resilience that takes these extremes into account. So from that standpoint, that's basically the background in terms of the drought conditions, what we might need to do, but then how this is potentially leading to a heavy hurricane season. And that's not water we can basically store. So here we're in, as everyone in our region knows, islands face water issues as well as hurricane issues.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Roger.
Watson.
Thank you for that overview. 85% above average, warmer oceans, but I like that you brought in sort of this sort of natural contradiction, right? An above average hurricane season. However, many of these Caribbean countries are water insecure as well, and that is that interplay is something that needs to be taken into account when we think about climate resilience. So as we think about climate resilience, and Ambassador, I'd love to go to you first. What does climate resilience look like? Right, for St. Kitts and Nevis, but also the wider Caribbean as well. Putting on your hat, having worked in, in a ministerial position in St. Kitts, but now here in Washington. In your view, what does that? How do we qualify what climate resilience is?
Thank you very much for that question. In St. Kitts and Nevis, as in the broader Caribbean, climate resilience manifests itself in a number of policies, initiatives, and strategies aimed at reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity. For us in St. Kitts and Nevis, this speaks to a top-down and a bottom-up approach, which involves the enacting of appropriate legislation and regulations, public awareness, and education campaigns. And part of all of that is really fighting against the myth that climate change does not exist. I think it is amazing that we're still fighting that battle. And so climate change is real, and we have to keep preaching that sermon. Implementation of early warning systems and protocols, recognition of and responsive research on the impact of climate change, monitoring air quality and excessive heat, which we all are passing through at this moment, through defined networks and mechanisms. I think we also have continuously to improve emergency and disaster response plans, because what would have worked 5 years ago is obsolete to some extent now. And so we have to create comprehensive disaster response plans that include training for community leaders, emergency shelters, and coordination is also going to be very important. The best laid plans can go awry if they're not well coordinated in their implementation. Redesigning, remodeling, introducing new materials and techniques in construction processes, because building codes have to adapt to new realities. Coastal zone management and construction of seawalls and drainage systems, which themselves have to be continuously monitored to avoid flooding. We also have to look at erosion caused by storm surges and heavy rainfall when that does occur. In St. Kitts and Nevis, we are strident in the quest to leverage our potential for renewable energy, which becomes a factor as well. The more the storms come, our dependence on fossil energy is really puts us in very compromising positions. And so try to look at renewable forms of energy, because a lot of our economies are based on how we are going to respond, for example, in tourism, in agriculture. And so energy is a factor there. There's scope for regional cooperation to share resources and best practices. And I think in St. Kitts and Nevis, we tend to do that. And certainly in the Eastern Caribbean, I think we have a greater cohesion in the way we respond and work together to these episodes. So I would say part of that is to retrofit schools and public buildings so that when disasters strike, as they will from time to time, our buildings are better able to withstand, and we are better able to bounce back from such episodes. That would be my contribution on this question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Great comments as always. I think this top-down plus bottom-up approach is the thing that really stuck out with me when we think about building some of these comprehensive plans that you and Minister Abrams both had discussed. And you mentioned the importance of regional coordination, and it makes me want to bring Therese into the conversation. Because I can't think of anybody better or institution better than to start to think about whether it's on the policy side or investment side on this aspect. But Therese, I would love to hear some of your comments about we understand that the geography of the Caribbean is a reason for their vulnerability, right? And Roger talked about the types of impacts that they get from La Nina and El Nino. But what are some of the how is the uniqueness of the region's economies also creating vulnerabilities to events to climatic events?
Thanks, Wasim, and great to be with this set of panelists, especially hearing from the minister and the ambassador. I mean, they've nailed it in terms of what we hope would be national responses, and Barbados is a really, really good example of the early warning system in particular. And of course, St. Kitts and Nevis just epitomizes what a small island development state is: small population, highly vulnerable to shocks, economic as well as natural disasters, but also at one point, St. Kitts and Nevis had a high debt ratio. What we're finding in the Caribbean is, as a result of what we're calling layered crises that confront the global economic system right now, the Caribbean really is at the front line of vulnerability. And we've been working, and many of you may know this already, in terms of the SIDS agenda, the Small Island Development States agenda, on compiling a multi-dimensional vulnerability index that the UN has finally, I think the world seems to be now coalescing around the value of having this complementary instrument that would be used as a complement to GNI per capita to allocate concessional financing across the 39 SIDS in the world, half of which are in the Caribbean. So for the CDB, we're really focused on one, helping to advocate for that, the use of the MBI, but also looking at any possible financial instrument that's going to help build the economic resilience of these countries. And I want to mention one that was a big focus in the SIDS conference this week, and that is looking at climate resilient debt clauses. This is something that it's not new, in that some small countries had used these instruments. Think about Grenada and Barbados implementing it some years ago. But now World Bank, IDB, CDB, we're also introducing these clauses to give countries some additional fiscal space in the event the natural disaster strikes. Now, this is just one tool along in a whole, I think, package of tools that countries need to think about when they're looking to insure against these natural disasters, right? So cat bonds, CRIF, as was mentioned by Minister Abrams, insurance generally, which is becoming much more difficult to get now for some property owners in the region, but also for governments to insure against the natural disasters. So we need we need a bigger set of tools to use to make sure that once these disasters hit countries in the region, that they're able to recover, not just in the short term, but also that the long-term development objectives and goals of these countries aren't compromised as a result. So I want to say that there's, having been in the SIDS meetings this week for a whole week, hearing from the UN, hearing from the IMF, hearing from the World Bank, hearing from IDB, hearing from other multilaterals, there seems to be a coming together now of that this is not something that is aspirational any longer, but I think there's a lot of meeting of minds around how we need to be approaching small island development states to help them deal with the shocks that are coming. I just want to say that on aspects that the ambassador just mentioned in terms of policies and making sure that issues around coastal resilience, coastal zone management, we're having many more requests from our clients to help with this. I can outline a lot of areas where we're having repeated a recurring theme in terms of these requests. One example, a community in Grenada on a coast where the water, because of coastal erosion, the seawater is now encroaching on a population of 4,000. Those people have to be relocated because the seawater infiltrating agricultural areas as well as properties where people are living. So this is not the future anymore. This is actually happening on a regular basis throughout this region. I see the ambassador shaking her head, but this is happening all the time. In Antigua this week, I mean, the heat of, I don't know if it was a heat wave, but I've not been that hot anywhere in the Caribbean for a long time. The temperature was regularly 87 degrees and with bright blue skies and no relief in sight. That this was the information coming out of the Bahamas too this week. And as was mentioned by the ambassador again, renewable energy is not, it's almost as if we need to have it now because the load shedding that our electricity distributors are having to do as a consequence of the additional demand for air conditioning and so on has become a real issue. And so renewable energy as a solution has to be part of the picture. I think that paints a good picture of what the bank is facing in helping our clients in the Caribbean deal with some of these threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. It's great to hear almost a readout of the SIDS conference this past week. And then I would imagine the Global Supply Chain Forum that previously. So actually, I feel privileged that after all those speaking engagements that you're still able to join us here on a Friday. But it's great to hear about that coming together, right? And I think that is something that we've seen from Caribbean leaders and stakeholders in the region that they've been pushing for quite some time, especially on the index. As when we talk about on the solution side of things, the bigger set of tools, we'll definitely dive into that a little bit, especially with regard to hurricane readiness. But you also talked about the Caribbean being on the front lines of vulnerability, and Stacey, would love to get your thoughts here, because we had this great report on gender come out on International Women's Day, where part of it focused on the disproportionate effects that women and girls in the Caribbean face, and in that report we really talked about if the Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and women and girls are among the most vulnerable populations, and indigenous communities among the most vulnerable populations in the region, it kind of makes them among the most vulnerable populations in the world. So we'd love to kind of get, when we think about resilience, right? We'd love to kind of hear how are things like hurricanes, effects of climate change affecting these types of populations, and what does resilience look like for them?
So thanks, Wazim, and it's great to be here. So thank you for having me. I couldn't agree more with the prior speakers, Minister Henry Martin, Roger, and Therese. They've all touched on some really important points. Maybe I'll take a step back. Kind of my deep expertise is at the nexus of climate and investment, and in particular, how to catalyze private sector investment for these issues. As we all know, private investment is absolutely necessary and public investment is absolutely insufficient. And even together, both public and private investment needs to be working more efficiently to address some of these issues. And that, for me, is a very local issue. All climate action is local. And we'll get into that, I hope, in this discussion, because the Caribbean is exposed kind of in a very uniquely local way. But also it's really very macro, right? If you aren't kind of orienting your public dollars and your private dollars towards this issue in every way you can, you are probably really inefficient with the dollars that you have, particularly given kind of the crisis of climate change and the fact that it's going to accelerate, right? We know we've locked in enough warming now that even if we stopped emitting today, we've got both kind of increasing physical risks in our future for a very long time, that all of which need to be managed around, but we need to become resilient too, so that we can reduce our vulnerability and have greater sustainability. But also, we absolutely must start this energy transition faster than we have up until now. So, that's kind of a big picture question. I will say, back to the kind of all climate action is local, that really does, for me, that is kind of really the starting point of how you address this from a financing perspective. So going to your question, Wazim, about communities, if all climate action is local, the communities for whom are, that are experiencing some of the increased hazards, are obviously very local. And understanding where the range of vulnerability is within a community is absolutely important to how we apply our financing and to how we apply our public financing to catalyze private financing, to how we build businesses, which are private sector, by nature in many cases, to address those local vulnerabilities. Those are all really, really important. We absolutely have to move from a defensive perspective around finance and climate risk. There's been a lot of work in the last 10 years on the role of insurance as a risk transfer mechanism and why it hasn't done enough. I think you can think about how insurance plays a functional role in financing resilience by being there to help fund kind of when the disasters hit. But we can also take a lesson from insurance in terms of how to incentivize or go on offense, really start to kind of put in, let's say, signals that insurance and insurability is a longer term, is there in the long term and available for companies, homeowners, communities, even countries, if resilience is addressed ex ante, right? So not ex post. So what do I mean by that? If you can take your public dollars, catalyze private investment to build in the resilience and reduce the vulnerability when these things happen, because we know they will continue to happen because of the warming we've locked in, I think you create the circumstances where you can crowd in more sustainable investment, not just kind of from a climate perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And you can keep insurance around longer, because as a tool, insurance does nothing to reduce risk, but it absolutely helps to transfer that risk when the events happen. I'm kind of excited by a lot of the things I'm starting to see on the policy side and on the macro side, by governments around the world who are starting to understand that we actually need to put in the incentives to get this stuff built, designed, developed ahead of the storms, ahead of the droughts. And one other thing Roger mentioned, which I think is absolutely important from a financing perspective, we're no longer talking about tail risks. Those tail risks are moving in and we're bouncing around. So Roger mentioned this kind of, ping-ponging back and forth between extreme drought and years of intense hurricane seasons. That is going to be the norm. So we aren't just preparing for one type of hazard, we're preparing for a lot of different hazards all at once, because this is physics, right? This is not somebody's kind of belief whether it's happening or not. The physical climate system is changing, and it has financial implications for every balance sheet, public or private.
Thank you, thank you, Stacey. And taking on your point on the need to move from the defensive, right? And I think that's been a theme throughout this entire conversation so far, is that climate resilience is, to the minister's point as well, is not just about focusing on the rebuilding, but focusing on what be prior to any sort of climate event happens. And as we think about tomorrow being the start of hurricane season, and love to get, ask all the panelists, a two-parter question. One is, what are some of the, and Roger, I'll start with you. What are some of the low-hanging tangible actions that governments, regional institutions, the private sector can take today or in the near future when it comes to hurricane readiness? And at the same time, to the, my earlier point, with G20 finance ministers meeting coming up, COP29, which I'm seeing is being dubbed the finance COP, what types of commitments, what types of actions, I think that's more appropriate, do you want to see coming out of those types of forums? Roger?
Right. Yeah, no, thanks very much. Wasn't growing up where we did in the Caribbean, we know sometimes that if a fruit is low hanging, it's because nobody wanted it. And so what we have to keep in mind is very much what Stacey was saying in terms of, let's think about this in terms of how we're reducing risk and we're increasing resilience, in which a test case would be hurricanes, right? And that's the outcome. I want to keep in mind a few things, and we've heard this across the board. As we think through this, there've been, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, they've paid out $245 million since 2007. The model that they use for the hurricane comes out of NOAA, that they use for the winds. We're trying to improve that from their standpoint on, how much hurricanes are intensifying. The early warning, we have the project called the Climate Risks for Early Warning. I co-chair the Early Warning Systems for All initiative for the UN that funds a lot of this stuff. But there's a major point regarding the spreading of risk versus the reduction of risk. And Stacey, spelled this out clearly. And this is where the financing of resilience becomes really important. During the 1990s, as some people who are old like me will know, that when we had the insurance, so-called the insurance crisis in the Caribbean, it was because Hurricane Andrew and La Loma Prieta earthquake hit the US and premiums rose in the Caribbean. There was nothing going on in the Caribbean. Premiums rose in the Caribbean. When we think about regional to local, what's the biggest issue anyone can face as we were facing the drought issue? Workers in the afternoon, construction, and the shutdown of the Panama Canal because of drought. We are facing globally networked risks as well. So we have to ask what is needed at each of these scales in order to act. As Prime Minister Motley constantly reminds me, women are not vulnerable, they're the most capable. And so the idea here is this. I will point to one case that we developed at the University of the West Indies, Stellar Group, when we were building the 5 Cs and all of this. A friend of mine, one of the heroes in the region, Leonard Nurse, I developed the master's program at the University of the West Indies, building out professionals, 130 of them around the region, who now bring local data on local vulnerabilities to the Climate Outlook Forum. 70% of them are girls and women. This sort of getting embedded capabilities at the local level is one of the things we sort of need to get our heads around, financing and sustaining. And from that standpoint, while we've had, the crew, the climate risk and so on for early warnings, and we've seen the contributions of PAC 2030, getting that finance aligned and defragmented to finance resilient people and not just resilient infrastructure becomes important. Another part of this we need to get our heads around before we move on is how well have the things we've put into place worked? In other words, what are the co-benefits of taking ecosystem-based approaches and doing better risk analyses? As Stacey and others know very well, the insurer of last resort is you, it's the public. So in a sense, we need both risk and resilience planning. And the way we frame it in the disasters community is proactive risk is important. How do we respond to the impending season we're seeing? But prospective risk is or even more important. How do we not let new risks arise? And finance along those two lines and asking how do we create a market for finance in the region, for resilience in the region becomes a critical question. And I know there's lots of insight on the team. I do want to point to one major success, the early warning system for climate timescales, led by David Farrell and CIMH and at CIMH, CIDIMA and others, is one of the most innovative such systems for trying to provide early warning system information across a climate timescale. And so there are innovations coming out of the region as well that we need to scale up beyond our pilots. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger. It's always important to highlight those success stories. And I think, you and Stacey have been part of our working groups, our private working groups. And one thing that we always do is whenever there's a success story, let's think about how we can replicate it. So I think that's a follow-up event that we'll definitely have to do. Ambassador, I want to go to you, then Therese, and then Stacey. Ambassador, to you, I want to ask, what is the role of governments here, right? Stacey brought up on private finance and catalyzing private finance. Therese talked about the role of the CDB and took a regional look at it. But when it comes to governments to making it easier to attract the necessary investors, working with CDB and others, what do you suggest is the role of governments here?
I think that the role of government falls under the banner of leadership, policy making, often resource allocation, and fostering collaboration. Through national climate resilience policies, I believe that goals can be outlined and priorities defined, actions recommended for reducing vulnerability to the impact of climate events, implementation and enforcement of strict building codes. That's always important. Integration of climate resilience in land use and planning so as to avoid risk areas when we're having new developments, and to protect natural buffers such as wetlands and mangroves and the like. Another role of government, investment in resilient public infrastructure. We know that hospitals and schools and bridges and roads and drainage systems must not only be built, they must be maintained, and they must be upgraded at all times to withstand the extreme weather events that, as everyone has said, will come. Interest in, I spoke to this before, and promotion of renewable energy, including solar, geothermal, so that we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and enhance our energy safety and security. Maintaining water management systems that are effective to prevent flooding and to ensure water supply in the event of droughts. Economic diversification is also something that has to be looked at, because for many of us who are in mono-economic areas, when disaster events happen, for example, tourism very often is knocked out for a bit. And so we have to also think about the agricultural crops that we're using, those that are hardier and that can bounce back a little quicker, so that food security is not severely impacted. And generally sustainable practices, promoting and ensuring that they are implemented. But I think regional and international collaboration also has a role to play in all of this. Keep our partners engaged, always be seeking best practices, seek to learn, use our diplomatic avenues for strengthening partnerships, so that in the event a disaster does strike, our partners are just an outreach away.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I know we're starting to run out of time, but Therese and Stacey, want to go to you, particularly on this question of, Therese, you talked a lot about, there's a coming together of some of the multilaterals. Well, it's time to see some action, hopefully coming out of that coming together. So what do you want to see out of forums like the G20 or COP29, the action and commitment? And then Stacey, I'm going to go to you for the same question, but taking more to the private sector side.
Okay, that's a big question. So, I mean, I think based on where we left the SIDS conversation yesterday, one, UN has to ratify the use of the MBI as a benchmark tool to be used also for, it's not just access to concessional finance, but also possible debt relief. So that's one. Two, Lost Santiago Network, loss and damage fund that was agreed at the last COP. the pledges have been made. That needs to be, that horrible word, operationalized, right? We need to know there's an advisory council that's been set up. CDB is going to be part of the advisory board, but we need to figure out how those funds will actually flow into whom, because it's not just about, as we've talked about earlier, it's not just about the recovery immediately after disaster, but what about the long term? What about the long term goals? I think on the G20 agenda, there's a lot in there for improving the balance sheets of MDBs, including CDB, use of hybrid capital, the SDRs of the IMF, and so on. Looking at callable capital, working with our credit rating agencies to think differently about how they look at our balance sheets, because there's a lot more that can be unpacked, for example, if we had access to the callable capital. But it's really the credit rating agencies that are holding on to that. And of course, if we can, everybody needs to have a AAA rating. CDB doesn't have a AAA rating, so we're in another category where we need to bring that up. And I think having more capital, having access to hybrid capital will help us do that a lot. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Therese. And Stacy, please.
All right, so I could spend another hour talking about my wish list and all the way down the kind of rabbit holes on some of these things, but I'll take two. I'll pick up where Therese just left off with it, which is, we really do need to make the tools in our toolbox that are kind of part of the public balance sheet, whether it's government budgets or the MDBs or the DFIs, all of which are forms of the public balance sheet. We need to make them more efficient and more effective. And that includes things like that callable capital. It also includes things like debt reform for governments, particularly those that are really vulnerable. But if we do that, then we can take that capital and be more strategic about how it's applied. The minister mentioned, there's a lot of public infrastructure that also needs to be resilient. When you think about how to use the public balance sheet, you have to think about it on a spectrum of strategic allocation. Those things that can crowd in private capital need less of those public dollars. They might still need a little bit to incentivize that, but they need less than those things that are squarely in the public good and squarely in public infrastructure that absolutely should be supported with public dollars. So there's a whole lot there that we could go down the rabbit hole on, but let me go back to your one of your original questions about women and the role of women in this fight. Roger said it best. Women are highly capable. One of the things I would love to see really is that the COP this year has got a much higher representation, hopefully equal or more. COP28 in Dubai had 19% country heads of delegations. Those were the people who were in the room negotiating agreed outcomes were women. 19%, less than 20% of the people in the room were women. It's not looking likely that it's going to change this year, but I think we all need to do something to kind of keep those in charge of COP29 accountable for creating inclusiveness and representation, because it's absolutely important and women are absolutely part of that. I also think, we know from the Caribbean itself that governments with higher female representation are also associated with greater outcomes, greater issue spotting on things that matter to the people, on the ground. And that's something that, I think is also something we can kind of call for across the board. It'd be great that if by the time we got to the next COP, COP30, that we were seeing that full representation of gender balance, at least in the COP processes and the negotiating rooms, and also from the private sector and finance. I come from a world that's not doing great on this anyway, but I can tell you that like more of gender balance and representation would be absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Stacy. Not only a call to action for hurricane readiness, but a call to action for greater female participation at COP29, and something, not just that topic, but everything we spoke about today. I think there will definitely be future conversations, both public and privately, about this, because there's an urgent need for many of the things and solutions that we've spoken about. I would once again like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. It was a very robust conversation ahead of the hurricane season, which kicks off tomorrow, along with, and Roger will appreciate this, the Cricket World Cup, of which I hope West Indies will do very, very well.
West Indies, yeah.
And Minister, thank you so much for joining and your comments to really set the tone as well. Jason Marzak, our Vice President Senior Director here, for his comments, and Jorge Castlemendi, the Senior Director of the Arch Rock Resilience Center, for his opening comments all the way from Philippines. So thank you so much as well. A shout out to Charlene Aguilera, who really led the execution of this event. Thank you so much. Can't be done without you. But once again, thank you to everybody and looking forward to our next engagement. Bye-bye.
Quiero que aunque el norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo son